This is it, the ultimate dimension for restin' stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
There are songs that everyone knows, sung loudly in crowds or hummed in kitchens while the kettle warms. But then, there are songs that belong to no one, that seem to drift in on the air without beginning or end, as though they existed before memory itself. This story begins with such a song, a melody so fragile, so tender, it felt like moonlight stretched into sound. No one could quite place where it came from, though whispers passed quietly that it had something to do with Rick, the scientist, the wanderer, the man who carried galaxies in his pockets and bottles in his hands. But the strange thing was, this song did not sound like him. It was not jagged or cynical. It was not wild or unhinged or wrapped in the kind of chaos he usually carried around like armor. No, this song was softer than breath. It was closer to a lullaby, and because of that, it felt even stranger. Before we begin, let me tell you something important. We love you. Truly, we do. You are cared for in ways you may not even realize. You belong here, in this quiet moment. So, before we drift further into the story, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? Just notice the answer in your own mind, no need to say it out loud. Now take a sip, if you have your coffee, or your tea, or just a glass of water nearby. Settle in, let the body rest, and let's begin together. The first time anyone noticed the melody, it was drifting across the night sky, faint as a cloud's edge. Morty, half asleep in his bed, thought it was just the wind brushing against the window. But it wasn't. It was something finer, more deliberate, a phrase of music that came, paused, and then returned. Like the stars themselves were trying to remember how to hum. Morty pressed his ear to the air. His chest ached in a way he couldn't explain. It didn't feel like one of Rick's experiments, the kind that usually blasted through the walls with noise and danger. This felt human. It felt like something you'd only sing if you were tired of pretending to be strong. The world outside remained still. The trees swayed gently, but there was no storm. The city lights pulsed in their ordinary rhythm, but the tune carried above them, steady, insistent, and yet impossibly soft. Morty thought about waking Rick to ask, but he didn't. Something in him knew this wasn't meant to be disturbed just yet. And so he lay there, awake in the dark, letting the strange lullaby drift over him. He imagined it wasn't coming from anywhere outside, but from somewhere older, somewhere folded inside the fabric of things, a lost note perhaps, carried forward by time itself. He closed his eyes, half afraid the sound would vanish, if he tried too hard to understand it. Rick, for his part, sat downstairs in the garage with his drink in hand, eyes unfocused. He heard it too, though he would never admit it, not then. To Rick, the melody was a ghost. It was a reminder of something he had once allowed himself to feel. He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the softness curling around him. He muttered something bitter under his breath, as though words could shatter the sound. But the song continued, as unbothered as the moon. Outside, the night itself seemed to lean closer. The clouds drifted slower. The stars blinked with long pauses between them. Even the crickets seemed to hush, leaving space for the music. It wasn't dramatic, no cosmic alarm bells, no warnings of impending doom. It was simply there, like a secret offered in kindness. For Morty, lying still, it stirred something he didn't have a name for. A tenderness, maybe. A remembering of safety he had barely known. He thought of his mother's voice when he was very small, humming to herself in the kitchen. He thought of summer laughing in the backyard, long before they were caught up in Rick's tangled adventures. He thought of simple things, sandwiches on a plate, sunlight across the floor. The song held all of that, as though it had been stitched together out of the gentlest fragments of memory. Morty whispered to himself, "Why does this feel like home?" He didn't expect an answer, and none came, but the question lingered like a thread woven into the music. Rick took another swallow of his drink, his face unreadable in the dim light of the garage. The tune pressed against him, and for a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to remember who he had once been. Someone who created not only weapons and portals, but something softer, a song, born not of genius or necessity, but of care. He clenched his jaw and turned away, as if the air itself had betrayed him. Still, the song carried on. The night stretched long, and the world seemed held in a kind of suspended stillness. Morty drifted towards sleep, and in that space between waking and dreaming, the melody followed him. It did not fade. It did not end. It simply accompanied him, like a hand resting gently on his shoulder. He dreamed of floating, not in a spaceship or a portal, but on a quiet sea made of starlight. The melody moved with the waves, guiding him deeper, softer. He woke the next morning not remembering the dream fully, but the sound stayed with him, like an aftertaste, like warmth in the chest that lingers long after the blanket has been pulled away. No one spoke of the song that morning. Summer was busy with her phone, Beth with her coffee, Jerry mumbling about the car insurance again. Morty looked at Rick, wondering if he should say something, but Rick only stared down at his tools, expression flat, as if daring anyone to ask. Morty kept quiet. Some things, he sensed, weren't ready to be said. The day passed like any other, yet beneath everything, beneath the chatter, the footsteps, the hum of machines, there was still that quiet strain of music waiting. A song no one admitted they had heard, a song too soft to name. And though it belonged to no one, though it drifted through the world like a secret no one was supposed to touch, the truth was that it had come from Rick. And that truth would linger, patient, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. For now, though, it was just a lullaby hidden in the night, a melody that stretched across silence, a song no one heard, except those who needed it most. Morty didn't tell anyone about the melody, not Rick, not Summer, not even himself in the mirror. Instead, he kept it tucked away like a secret stone in his pocket, something he could turn over quietly, when no one was looking. The truth was, he heard it most clearly in dreams. The nights stretched long, and when sleep finally came for him, it came gently, with the tune woven through the spaces between thoughts. The song wasn't loud or insistent. It was softer than silence itself, a murmur that lingered just beneath the heartbeat. And in that place between waking and dreaming, Morty felt the world tilt ever so slightly toward wonder. He would close his eyes and find himself among stars. Not Rick's stars. Not the ones streaking past as they hurtled through portals, chased by creatures or schemes too strange to name. These stars were quiet. They didn't rush or burn with violence. They simply were. And between them, in the long and endless hush, the melody floated, fragile and patient, as though the universe itself were humming in its sleep. Morty always stood still in these dreams, not daring to move. He was afraid that if he shifted, even a little, the music would shatter like thin glass, so he breathed slowly, carefully, and listened. Each note seemed to carry something inside it, some memory that wasn't his but felt familiar anyway. The sound of rain tapping a window, the warmth of a hand that once held his, the laughter of someone who had long since slipped into the folds of time. He didn't understand why it mattered so much. Rick's inventions had filled his life with noise, alarms, explosions, arguments, the crackle of electricity tearing through space, and yet here was something else, something that felt almost human. Morty knew Rick didn't do human well, but the song, it felt as though it had been born from the part of Rick no one was supposed to see. Still, Morty said nothing. One night, as he drifted back into the dream of stars, he thought he heard words beneath the tune. Not lyrics, exactly. More like the suggestion of words, syllables half-formed, dissolving before he could catch them. He strained to listen. The closer he leaned, the softer they became, until they were little more than sighs carried on the breath of the cosmos. He whispered into the dream, "What are you trying to tell me?" But the question faded into the vastness, unanswered. The silence after was not empty. It was full, like the pause between a heartbeat and the next. Morty realized then that maybe the song didn't want to explain itself. Maybe it just wanted to be heard. When he woke, his room was dim with early morning light, and the sound was gone. But the feeling remained, clinging to him like a shadow of warmth. He pressed his palms into his eyes, whispering, "I don't get it." He didn't know why his chest felt heavier, or why he wanted to cry, or why he didn't. He only knew he wanted to hear it again. Days slipped into one another. Rick tinkered loudly in the garage, bottles clinking around him like punctuation. Summer grumbled about school. Jerry tried too hard to be useful. Beth floated in and out, tired but steady. Life carried on, as it always did, but Morty carried the secret melody beneath it all, like an invisible thread weaving through the fabric of his days. Sometimes, in class, he would catch himself humming under his breath. Just a fragment, no more than 3 or 4 notes, but enough to make the hairs on his arms rise. His teacher never noticed, though once the kid sitting beside him tilted his head and frowned, as if trying to place the sound. Morty clamped his mouth shut after that, cheeks burning. It wasn't ready to be shared. Not yet. One evening, Morty sat outside alone. The air was cool, the kind of chill that sneaks into bones but carries clarity with it. Above him, the sky unfolded in infinite dark. He tipped his head back, searching for the stars he always saw in his dreams. They were the same, and yet different, brighter, perhaps, or maybe just lonelier. He wondered if they were singing still, somewhere just beyond hearing. And then it happened. Faintly. Just at the edge of perception. A thread of the melody reached him, slipping through the night air like breath escaping a dream. His heart leapt. He leaned into the silence, straining. The sound was fragile, nearly lost to the wind, but it was there. He closed his eyes, letting it wash over him, and for a moment he felt less like Morty. Clumsy, anxious Morty, and more like something wider, something stretched across space. The melody did not linger long. It brushed past him, gentle as a moth's wing, and was gone. Yet the silence it left behind was alive. He felt it sitting with him, patient and kind, the way a friend might sit beside you without speaking. Morty hugged his knees and whispered into the darkness, "I won't forget. I promise." He didn't know who he was speaking to. Maybe the stars. Maybe the song itself. Maybe to Rick, though Rick would never admit it. But promises made in silence have a way of binding themselves to memory, and this one did. Later, when Rick stomped past him muttering about failed circuits and stubborn equations, Morty almost asked. The words rose in his throat, trembling, but he swallowed them back down. Something told him that if he asked too soon, the spell would break, the melody would vanish into the noise of explanations and sarcasm. No, this was his, for now, and so Morty carried it in secret. He walked with it, dreamed with it, held it like a lantern no one else could see. He didn't know what it meant, or why it had chosen him, but he knew it mattered. The silence between stars was no longer empty. It had a song now, and he would listen, even if no one else ever did. Rick Sanchez had lived so many lives that most of them blurred together. Portals opened, worlds collided, universes burned and were rebuilt, all of it stacked inside his memory like dusty books on a forgotten shelf. He rarely returned to those shelves. He preferred to drown them in noise, in invention, in drink. But every so often, something small would slip through the cracks, tugging at him in the quiet moments when he thought no one was watching. The song was one of those things. Long ago, before Morty, before Summer, before he'd chosen to wear cynicism like armor, Rick had built a device that wasn't meant for conquest or travel or destruction. It was meant for listening, not to planets or signals or alien chatter, but to the spaces between things, to the vibrations that stitched one universe to the next. He called it, with uncharacteristic softness, the resonance collector. He never told anyone the name. It sounded too delicate, too sentimental, too far removed from the Rick everyone knew. The machine was no larger than a suitcase, wires tangled like veins around a humming crystal core. He had built it not with efficiency in mind, but with care, soldering the connections, as though each one mattered. And when he first turned it on, late at night in a silence not unlike Morty's dream, he was startled by what he heard. Music. Not music in the way humans strummed guitars or pressed piano keys. This was older, wider, a sound born not of performance but of existence itself. It was the hum of stars cooling, of planets breathing, of life beginning quietly in the shadows. The collector did not invent the song. It revealed what was already there. And Rick, for the first and only time, found himself listening without trying to dissect. Among all the fragments it gathered, one song lodged itself inside him. Fragile, gentle, impossibly small, and yet it carried weight beyond measure. It reminded him of things he didn't want to remember, the scent of someone he had loved once, the look in a pair of eyes that trusted him, the shape of a promise he had broken. He couldn't bear it. Rick shut the collector down. He shoved it into the back of the garage, under tarps and boxes, buried among failures he preferred to laugh at rather than mourn. He told himself it was useless, just noise, just interference. He told himself all kinds of things. But the truth was simpler. The song had made him feel, and he didn't want to. Years passed. He forgot, or pretended to. But the universe doesn't forget. The tune lingered in the fabric of things, patient as dusk, and slowly, softly, it began to leak back into the world. Morty didn't know any of this. He only knew the way the melody curled into his dreams, wrapping itself around his heart with a tenderness that frightened him. He wondered where it came from, but he never guessed the truth. That it was Rick's, and that Rick had once created something not for power, but for gentleness. Rick, meanwhile, tried not to hear it. When the faint strains brushed against his ears at night, he drowned them in the rattle of a bottle or the buzz of machinery. He told himself it was nothing, but every so often, in the long pauses between distractions, he caught himself humming a phrase of it without meaning to. He would stop instantly, jaw clenched, as though caught in a crime. One night, long before Morty was old enough to notice, Rick had sat alone with the collector. He had activated it just to see if the song was still there. It was. Unchanged, unwavering, like the universe itself was whispering back to him. His chest tightened. His hand trembled against the switch. He wanted to destroy it, to erase the sound completely, but he couldn't. Instead, he turned the machine off and shoved it deeper into the shadows. He never told anyone. To speak of it would have been to admit that somewhere, beneath the sarcasm and bravado, he was capable of softness. And Rick Sanchez did not do softness. At least, not in daylight. But the thing about songs is that they don't obey rules. They don't stay buried just because you want them to. They seep through cracks, carried by wind, woven into silence, and the one Rick had tried to bury was patient enough to wait for Morty. On nights when Morty dreamed of stars, Rick sometimes dreamed too, though he would never confess it. His dreams were darker, fractured, threaded with regret, and yet, always in the background, there it was, the same lullaby, calling to him across time. He would wake sweating, scowling, pretending it meant nothing. But the feeling stayed. The garage still held the resonance collector. Dust settled over its edges, wires stiff with neglect, but the crystal inside still pulsed faintly, like a sleeping heart. Rick avoided it. He piled other projects on top of it, as though clutter could erase memory. But even through the weight of years, the machine waited. Morty, unknowingly, became the new vessel for the melody. His silence, his curiosity, his tenderness, these were the places where the song took root, and in carrying it quietly, he was already doing what Rick could not, letting it live. One evening, Morty stood at the garage door, watching Rick bent over some invention, sparks flying. He almost asked, "Hey Rick, do you ever hear music when it's really quiet?" But the words snagged in his throat. Rick's back was hunched, shoulders heavy, his muttering sharp. Morty swallowed the question, tucking it away for later. Rick didn't look up, but he heard anyway. The memory of the collector pressed against him, stubborn as breath. He tightened a screw too hard, snapped the thread, and cursed under his breath. The sound of the lullaby flickered again in the silence after. He hated how it made his chest ache. He hated that he remembered. But the universe didn't care about his denial. The song had returned, and whether Rick faced it or not, it would continue. It would find its way into ears that could bear it, into Morty's dreams, into the spaces Rick thought were empty. The resonance collector sat quiet, but not dead. Its crystal glowed faintly beneath the dust, like a heartbeat too stubborn to fade. Somewhere, somehow, the lullaby kept breathing. And though Rick told himself it was forgotten, he knew the truth. Nothing sung with tenderness is ever truly lost. There are nights when the world feels too heavy for Rick Sanchez. Nights when the glow of machinery in the garage is no comfort. When even the strongest drink tastes like water. On those nights, he slips away from the clutter, and climbs to the roof with Morty trailing behind. Two shadows carrying paper plates and sandwiches, wrapped messily in foil. The roof isn't special. Just shingles, a patch of tar, the faint creak of wood beneath them. But from up there, the universe stretches wide, endless, and forgiving. The stars don't care about Rick's mistakes. They don't care about Morty's confusion or his fear. They shine anyway, quietly, as though their only purpose is to remind small hearts that they are not alone. Morty sits cross-legged, unwrapping his sandwich. The bread is squished on one side, the cheese sliding off, but he doesn't mind. There's something about eating outside, in the cool of night, that makes even a sloppy sandwich feel sacred. Rick plops down beside him, grumbling about his knees, but when he takes his first bite, he sighs in a way Morty rarely hears. Not quite relief, not quite surrender, but close. They eat in silence for a while, a comfortable silence. Crickets hum from the yard. Somewhere far away, a car passes on the road. The wind lifts faint strands of Morty's hair. And in that between quiet, without realizing it, Morty begins to hum. It's soft, thoughtless, like air escaping gently. The strange melody that had visited him in dreams spills into the night, weaving itself around them. Morty doesn't notice at first. It isn't even a decision. The song simply moves through him, the way rivers move toward the sea. Rick freezes. His sandwich hovers half, bitten in his hand. His eyes narrow, then soften, then harden again, cycling through emotions too fast for Morty to see. The tune is unmistakable. The very same one Rick had buried years ago, tucked into the resonance collector, hidden under boxes and tarps like a shameful secret. And here it is, floating effortlessly out of Morty's throat. What? Morty asks, startled when he realizes Rick is staring at him. His voice cracks, guilty, as though he's been caught stealing. I don't know. I heard it somewhere, I guess. It's stuck in my head. Rick doesn't answer right away. He looks at Morty the way a person might look at a mirror they don't want to face. A long pause stretches between them. Then, quietly, Rick sets his sandwich down and tilts his head back to the stars. That song, he says at last, voice rough. You didn't just hear it somewhere. Morty frowns. Then where's it from? Rick doesn't reply. His chest feels heavy. Memories stir. Of the collector, of a night long ago, when he'd let his guard down, of someone he once loved enough to write something that fragile for. He wants to dismiss it, to laugh it off, to make some cruel joke. But he can't. The melody is too alive in Morty's voice, too innocent. Morty keeps humming, softly now, as though afraid it will vanish if he stops. The notes carry into the night air, brushing against stars that seem to twinkle just a little brighter. Rick closes his eyes. For a fleeting second, he isn't a genius or a cynic or a drunk. He's just a man, listening to a lullaby he once tried to forget. Rick, Morty says gently, sensing the shift in him. Did you make it? The question lands like a stone in Rick's chest. He opens his mouth, then closes it. His instinct is to deny, to sneer, to protect himself. But under the softness of Morty's tone, he feels the edges of his armor bending. Finally, in a low, almost reluctant voice, he admits, yeah, once, a long time ago. Morty blinks. But it doesn't sound like you. That makes Rick huff a broken laugh. Yeah, no kidding. His eyes stay fixed on the stars. Guess that was the point. The night deepens. They don't speak much after that. Rick doesn't explain where the song came from, or why he wrote it. Morty doesn't press him. Some truths don't need words, they hum quietly in the spaces between people, filling them with a closeness that's deeper than explanation. After a while, Morty lays back against the shingles, sandwich forgotten beside him. His eyes blur with starlight, he keeps humming, the melody weaving in and out of breath. Rick sits upright, pretending not to listen, but every note lands inside him like a memory he can't escape. The song doesn't belong to him anymore. He realizes that, watching Morty's chest rise and fall with the rhythm. Somehow, impossibly, the tune has leapt from his past into Morty's present, reshaped into something lighter, freer. And maybe that's what music is meant to do, escape its maker, and become part of someone else's life. Rick doesn't say any of this out loud. He just picks up his sandwich again, takes another bite, and mutters, "Don't go humming that around other people, Morty. They'll think you're nuts." Morty smiles faintly, eyes still on the stars. "Yeah, okay, Rick." But he knows he won't stop, he can't. The song feels too true, too much like breathing. The night drapes itself around them, heavy but gentle. Somewhere below, the house is dark, the world asleep. Up here, only two figures sit together, bound not by science or adventure, but by something far smaller, softer. Rick doesn't finish his sandwich. Morty drifts close to sleep, humming until the melody thins into silence, and for once, Rick doesn't interrupt. He lets the quiet be what it is. Above them, the stars listen. And though Rick would never admit it, he feels for a fragile moment, less alone. Rick Sanchez did not often allow himself to remember. Memory was dangerous. It cut deeper than blades, lingered longer than bruises, and showed up most often when the bottle ran dry. He had made a career of forgetting, of blotting out every fragile piece of himself with noise and invention and alcohol. Yet memories have a way of finding their way back, the same way a melody slips into the quiet when no one asks it to. The song was one such memory. It belonged to a night Rick had buried under thousands of others. A night not filled with science or chaos or laughter, but with silence. A silence he had once shared with someone he loved. She had been different from the people who usually drifted into his orbit. She didn't marvel at his genius the way others did, didn't shrink under his cynicism. She simply sat beside him and listened. Not to the inventions, not to the theories, not to the bravado, but to him. To the pauses between his words, to the quiet he didn't know how to hold on his own. On one of those nights, younger, softer, and still capable of hope, Rick had picked up a small instrument, not one from Earth, not quite from anywhere. A creation of his own, cobbled from strings of alien resonance wire, and the carved shell of something that had never belonged to a single world. He tuned it awkwardly, clumsy for once, and when he played, the song came out like a confession, fragile, uneven, honest. It was the only time he ever wrote something that wasn't meant to impress or overwhelm. It wasn't for an audience, or for recognition. It was for her. A lullaby, shaped not of science but of the trembling place in his chest, that longed for connection. She had closed her eyes, listening. And when the last notes dissolved, she whispered only, "That sounds like you." That sentence had destroyed him. Because it wasn't true, not in the version of himself he had tried to live up to. Rick Sanchez was supposed to be brilliant, indestructible, untouchable, not fragile, not soft, and yet she had seen him, really seen him, in a way no one else had. He didn't play the song again. Not for her, not for anyone. To play it would be to admit the truth, that somewhere inside the endless machinery of his mind, there lived a heart, still beating, still capable of tenderness. He couldn't bear it. He drowned it in drinks, in noise, in exile. He buried the lullaby as though it were evidence of a crime. And yet, here it was again, years later, spilling innocently out of Morty's throat as they sat on the roof, eating sandwiches. That night, When Morty fell asleep in his own bed, Rick stayed awake. He poured drink after drink, but the burn didn't silence the memory. If anything, it made it sharper. He saw her face when she'd listened to him play, the way her hand had rested lightly against his knee, her smile small and knowing. He had not deserved it then. He did not deserve it now. The memory ached. It clawed at him like a wound that had never healed. And for once, he didn't make a joke. He didn't mask it with science or fury. He just sat in the garage, staring at the forgotten shape of the resonance collector buried under dust, and let himself feel. Morty entered quietly sometime near dawn. His eyes were tired, but he carried a mug of coffee, steam curling like a soft ghost. He set it on the workbench beside Rick without a word. Rick didn't look up. "Rick," Morty said hesitantly, "that song you don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but it feels like it means something to you." Rick snorted, but it was thin, hollow. "Means I was stupid once." Morty shook his head. "No, it doesn't sound stupid. It sounds real." The word hung between them. Real. Rick hated and loved it all at once. His eyes burned from the alcohol, but beneath the sting was something older, rawer. Finally, after a long silence, Rick muttered, "I played it once. For someone. Long time ago." Morty didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He could hear the answer in Rick's voice, in the way it trembled and steadied at the same time. Rick rubbed at his eyes, then grabbed the mug, though he didn't drink from it. "Thing is, Morty, the smartest thing I ever built, the sharpest thing I ever did, none of it mattered. Not really. And the one time I let myself, be human." He broke off, shaking his head. "That's the one thing I couldn't handle." Morty's chest tightened. He wanted to say something comforting, something that would make it easier. But instead he did the one thing Rick hadn't expected. He began to hum. Soft, simple, the melody they both knew. Rick winced, his hand tightened on the mug. But he didn't tell him to stop. He let the song drift into the garage, let it fill the empty corners of memory. And for a moment, just a moment, the ache in his chest softened into something else. Not gone, not healed, but gentler. Morty hummed until his eyes closed, leaning against the workbench. Rick stared at him. At the boy who carried the melody now without knowing its weight. He felt something crack inside him. Not in a way that broke him apart, but in a way that let light slip through. He whispered into the quiet, too softly for Morty to hear, "She would have liked you." Then he tipped back the mug of cold coffee, grimaced, and reached for the bottle. Memory was dangerous, yes. But tonight, at least, he didn't feel entirely alone in it. It began so faintly that no one noticed. A sound softer than a sigh, woven into the edges of wind and water. It wasn't played on instruments, nor broadcast from speakers. It was as though the earth itself had remembered a song it once knew, and had chosen, gently, to hum it back. On the first night, Morty thought it was his imagination. He sat by his window, listening to the breeze stir the branches of the old oak in the yard. The leaves rustled in a pattern he almost recognized. A fragment of the melody from his dreams seemed to slip through the night air. Morty leaned forward, holding his breath, afraid that if he blinked, it would vanish. But the sound didn't vanish. The sound spread. The oceans began first, their tides swelling with a rhythm that carried echoes of the lullaby. Fishermen in distant harbors swore they could hear voices in the waves, not threatening, not strange, but tender. The water sang softly against the hulls of their boats, like a parent calming a restless child. In the cities, the hum threaded itself into the glow of neon lights and the hiss of traffic. People waiting at crosswalks glanced at each other, puzzled, as though the noise of the world had changed key. It wasn't loud. If anything, it was subtle enough that many shrugged it off, but for those who listened closely, there was no mistaking it. A gentle melody hiding beneath the ordinary chaos of life. Even the winds carried it. Travelers crossing deserts heard it in the sigh of dunes. Climbers in the mountains felt it brush past their ears, a whisper that rose with altitude. The sky itself seemed to breathe the tune, steady and calm, as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. Rick noticed too, though he didn't admit it. One evening, he stood in the garage doorway, cigarette dangling from his lips, watching the horizon fade into twilight. The wind stirred, low and even, and there it was again. The lullaby. He clenched his jaw, angry at himself for hearing it. He told himself it was coincidence, just Morty's humming stuck in his head. But the truth pressed harder. The song was no longer theirs alone. The world had picked it up. He downed his drink and muttered, "Goddamn parasites." But his voice trembled, betraying him. Meanwhile, people across the planet felt the shift without knowing why. A woman in Tokyo paused in her work, and, for no reason she could name, let her shoulders relax. A child in Cairo stopped crying when the wind rattled the shutters, soothed by something no one else in the room could hear. Strangers smiled at each other on trains, in markets, on sidewalks, as though a hidden cord connected them. The scientists tried to measure it. Some claimed it was a natural frequency of the Earth, a resonance caused by atmospheric pressure or seismic murmurs. The news ran stories, speculation spread, but the explanations never quite fit, because this was not noise, this was music, and music does not ask to be understood, it only asks to be felt. Morty noticed the changes most of all. He walked through school and caught teachers speaking more gently, students whispering less harshly. The halls felt softer, lighter, though no one could say why. At home, the family dinners that usually dissolved into bickering held small pockets of silence, not tense but peaceful. Even Summer looked up from her phone sometimes, distracted by the faint tune in the distance, her brow furrowing as though remembering something just out of reach. "Rick," Morty asked one night, hesitant. Is it supposed to be happening, like, everywhere?" Rick didn't answer at first. He was hunched over the workbench, fiddling with a half-finished gadget, but his movements were slower than usual. Finally he exhaled through his nose. "Supposed to? Nah. But nothing ever goes the way it's supposed to." Morty bit his lip. "Then why does it feel good?" Rick shot him a look, the kind that was sharp on the surface but tired underneath. "Because you're a kid, Morty. You think everything soft is good. World doesn't work like that." But when Morty turned away, Rick closed his eyes for just a second. And in the hum that threaded through the night, he felt something he would never admit: relief. The earth was humming, yes, but it was not a threat, it was a balm, a small impossible gift, and for reasons Rick couldn't explain, humanity seemed to be leaning into it. There were fewer arguments in supermarkets, fewer honks in traffic. Couples who had been distant found themselves speaking again, not in grand gestures but in little ways. Passing the salt gently, asking how the day went, humming in their sleep. No wars were ended, no grand revolutions were sparked, but the edges of human life softened, just enough to notice. Rick told himself it wouldn't last. He muttered about entropy, about people being too stubborn to change. But when he lay in bed at night, pretending not to listen, he heard it too. The planet itself carrying his forgotten song, giving it back to the people who needed it. He hated it. He loved it. He couldn't look at it directly, and so the earth hummed, a quiet, steady note beneath all the noise. Morty, lying awake in his room, whispered the melody into the dark. And somewhere deep inside, Rick stared at the ceiling and let the memory ache, the one he had tried so hard to drink away. The song was no longer just his secret, no longer just Morty's dream. It belonged to the world now, and the world was listening. Morty had never thought of himself as special. He wasn't the genius in the family, not the strong one, not the confident one. He was the one who followed, who stumbled, who tried to keep up. And yet, as the earth's quiet hum deepened, Morty found himself carrying a secret he didn't know how to name. The song was inside him now, not just in dreams, not just in passing moments, but in his waking life. He began to notice things. Small things, the kind most people overlooked. At school, the hallways still buzzed with noise, but under it, There was a gentleness. A boy who usually shoved others out of the way in the lunch line paused, letting someone else go first. Two girls who had been locked in a week-long fight suddenly sat side by side, laughing softly as though nothing had ever come between them. Morty didn't think they even realized what had shifted, but he did. He could hear the faint hum threaded into their voices. On his walk home, the neighborhood felt changed too. A neighbor who rarely looked up from her garden waved at him. A dog that barked at everyone passing by simply wagged its tail. The world wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but something subtle was moving through it. And every time Morty noticed, the same thought tugged at him, is this the song? He began humming more often, sometimes without meaning to. In the shower, at his desk, walking down the street. When he hummed, strangers glanced at him oddly, then smiled, as if something about the tune softened their day. Morty blushed, embarrassed, but he didn't stop. The melody felt alive inside him, and to keep it locked away seemed almost cruel. At dinner one evening, Morty's mother spoke more gently than usual. Her eyes softened when she asked how school was. Summer rolled her eyes, but Morty saw it. The faintest trace of the tune hiding in the way his mom's voice lingered at the end of her sentences. Even Jerry, who usually stumbled over small talk and wore defeat like a second skin, seemed different. He hummed under his breath while setting the table, completely unaware of himself. Morty almost laughed. His dad couldn't keep a job, couldn't fix a leaky faucet, couldn't carry a conversation without tripping. But here he was, humming the song like it belonged to him. And somehow, it worked. For the first time in a long while, Jerry didn't seem like a failure. He seemed human. Morty lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the little changes. The song was moving through people like a current, gentle, invisible, unstoppable. It wasn't fixing the world, but it was softening it. He wondered what it meant, why it had chosen now to return, and what Rick wasn't telling him. Because Rick always knew more than he said. Rick. Morty whispered one night while sitting in the garage. What if the song is, like, fixing things? What if it's making people kinder? Rick snorted without looking up from his tools. Kinda knave, don't you think, Morty? People don't change, they adapt, they pretend. Give it a week, and they'll be back to stabbing each other for parking spaces. But, Morty pressed, what if this time it's different? Rick's hand paused on a screwdriver. Just for a fraction of a second, Morty thought he saw something flicker across his face. But then Rick grunted and went back to his work. Don't read into it, Morty. It's noise. Noise fades. Morty frowned, but he didn't argue. He knew Rick was hiding something. He knew the song wasn't just noise. And for the first time, Morty wasn't content to just follow blindly. He wanted to understand. The next day, walking home from school, he stopped at the park. Children ran across the grass, their laughter strangely melodic. Parents on benches hummed absent-mindedly as they watched. A breeze carried the tune in soft waves, brushing against the trees, rippling the pond. Morty closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. For a moment, he felt as though the entire world was breathing in rhythm, connected by invisible threads. He thought about Rick then. About the way he had frozen when Morty hummed the tune on the roof. The way his eyes had gone sharp and distant. There was a story buried there, one Rick wouldn't tell. Morty's chest tightened. He didn't want to force Rick to talk, but he also didn't want the song to vanish back into silence, hidden under shame. So Morty did the only thing he could. He carried it forward. He hummed in the park, softly at first, then louder, not caring if anyone stared. A few kids glanced at him, then, almost instinctively, hummed the same notes back. Their laughter bent around the melody, rising and falling like the lullaby itself. Morty smiled. It was working, even if he didn't know how. That night, as he lay in bed, Morty whispered into the dark, "It's real. I know it's real." He didn't know who he was talking to. Rick, the universe, himself. But the words felt important. Curiosity stirred in him like a flame. He wanted to know where the song came from, why it lingered, why it chose him. But beneath that curiosity was something quieter, something even stronger. He wanted to protect it. He didn't want it to be swallowed by Rick's silence or lost in the noise of the world. And so Morty made a choice. He would keep humming. Not loudly, not for recognition, not for credit. Just softly, in the spaces between moments. On the walk home, in the quiet of his room, in the pauses of conversation. He would keep the song alive, even if no one else noticed. Because deep down, Morty believed something Rick could not bring himself to believe, that softness mattered. That kindness mattered. That sometimes, the smallest melody could be the loudest answer. And as the earth hummed on, Morty's gentle curiosity bloomed into something else, a quiet kind of purpose. Summer wasn't usually the type to sit still. She was restless, always moving between friends, screens, plans, and distractions. If Morty carried the weight of curiosity and Rick carried the weight of knowledge, Summer carried the restless energy of wanting to be anywhere else. But on one quiet evening, as twilight crept in, and the world outside softened into shadows, she found herself doing something unusual, sitting by the window. It wasn't planned. She had been scrolling on her phone, annoyed at the slowness of the Wi-Fi, when she noticed a faint sound outside. Not quite music, not quite wind, something in between. She thought at first it was her imagination, but when she leaned toward the glass, there it was. That gentle tune. The hum seemed to float in through the half-open window, weaving itself between the branches of the tree outside, sliding along the sill, and brushing against her skin. Summer frowned. She didn't know why, but it reminded her of something. Not anything exact, just a feeling. Safety. Childhood. A time before the world felt complicated and jagged. She set her phone down without thinking, folding her knees up to her chest, and simply listened. The melody wasn't loud. It wasn't even consistent. It came in little waves, like light through moving leaves, shifting and returning, never quite repeating the same way twice. But each time it touched her, Summer felt her breath slow, her thoughts soften. She wasn't thinking about who texted her back, or what she would wear tomorrow, or how annoying her family could be. She was just there. Listening. It had been a long time since she felt that way. Her memories tugged at her gently, unbidden. She thought of when she was small, when she used to sit by a different window, in a different house, waiting for her mom to come home. She remembered pressing her face to the glass, watching for headlights in the driveway. Back then, the world was small enough that the sound of a car door shutting meant everything was okay. Back then, bedtime stories still mattered, and lullabies still worked. Summer hugged her knees tighter. She didn't want to admit it, but the hum was pulling her back toward that feeling. Like someone cared, like someone was watching over her, even if they weren't in the room. For once, she didn't roll her eyes at herself. She just let it happen. Downstairs, she could hear faint murmurs, Morty humming to himself, their mom clattering dishes in the sink, Jerry shuffling papers he didn't understand. The house felt different tonight, lighter. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it was like the walls themselves had softened, carrying the same secret music she was hearing through the window. She whispered to herself without realizing it. "It's kinda beautiful." The words surprised her. Summer didn't usually admit when something moved her. Sarcasm was easier. It protected her. But here, in the pale glow of the window, with the tune floating in, she didn't feel the need to be guarded. She let herself just be. The hum wrapped itself around her thoughts. She wondered if Morty felt it too. He seemed different lately, a little softer, like he was carrying something important. She had teased him about it, of course. Teasing Morty was second nature. But maybe there was more going on than she realized. She tilted her head against the glass and sighed. We're all hearing it," she murmured. Summer closed her eyes. The hum wasn't just sound anymore. It was memory, warmth, light. It was sitting in a car half asleep as streetlights passed. It was drifting in and out of dreams on long summer afternoons. It was the comfort of a blanket fresh from the dryer. All the small, wordless things that made her feel safe, collected into one invisible melody. She didn't try to analyze it. For once, she didn't need an explanation. Rick could figure out the science of it if he wanted to. Morty could follow it like a mystery. She would just listen. And for the first time in what felt like years, she felt close to her family. Not because they were doing anything together, not because anyone had changed, but because the song had threaded itself through the house, tying them all with invisible threads. Summer opened her eyes again, glancing at the clouds drifting past the moon. She thought, just for a second, that she saw them moving in rhythm, pulsing faintly to the same melody she heard. She blinked, and the illusion faded. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe the song was larger than she could imagine, carried not just through air and walls, but through the sky itself. She smiled faintly, almost embarrassed at herself. "Okay, fine," she whispered, "it's kinda magical." And it was. For the rest of the night, she didn't touch her phone. She didn't fill the silence with noise. She didn't feel restless. She just stayed by the window, letting the melody carry her into a gentler state of being. She didn't know if it would last. The world was still messy, still sharp. But here, for this moment, in the glow of the window's light, Summer allowed herself to believe in the softness of things. She let herself belong to the song, if only quietly, if only for tonight. And when she finally crawled into bed, the hum still lingering faintly in the air, she fell asleep without resistance. Her dreams softened by music she didn't fully understand, but trusted all the same. Rick never liked silence. To him, it was a space waiting to be filled, and he filled it with inventions, with bottles, with jokes that cut sharp enough to keep people away. But lately, the silence had been pressing closer, and worse, it carried something familiar. The melody. He had tried to ignore it, tried to drown it out with static from his gadgets, with the buzz of his portal gun, with a drink poured a little too quickly. But everywhere he went, it followed, softly, insistently. It hummed through the garage walls when he soldered wires. It lingered at the edge of his thoughts when he muttered equations. He even heard it once in the bubbles of his drink, and that had been the worst of all. Rick was clever enough to know he couldn't run from something like this. He had created it, after all. Long ago, in one of his rare moments of vulnerability, he had built something not to conquer, not to escape, not to win, but to feel. He hated admitting that. He hated remembering it. Morty had been the one to bring it back. Rick hadn't expected that. A casual hum, a careless echo, and suddenly the old memory had come rushing out like a tide. Morty didn't even know what he was holding in his voice, but Rick knew. He had known instantly, and it had burned. Tonight, Morty found him sitting on the garage floor, legs stretched out, back against a stack of boxes. The workbench was cluttered, the air smelled faintly of smoke, and in Rick's hand was a flask he hadn't touched in the last 10 minutes. Which, for Rick, was unusual. Rick. Morty's voice was hesitant. He had learned by now that approaching his grandfather during these moods was like approaching a cornered animal. Careful, slow, no sudden movements. Rick didn't look up. "What, Morty? You've been quiet." Rick let out a sharp laugh. "Don't get used to it." He tipped the flask but didn't drink. Instead, he rolled it between his fingers. The silence stretched, and Morty almost left, almost backed away into the safety of not knowing. But the song was still humming faintly in the back of his mind, and something in him wanted to understand. "Rick, that song, the one I hummed. You recognized it, didn't you?" The words hung in the air, fragile, waiting to shatter. Rick closed his eyes. He could lie. He always lied. Lies were easy, safer than the truth, but he was tired. The song had worn him thin. "Yeah," Rick muttered, voice rough. "I recognized it." Morty waited. When Rick didn't continue, he pressed, softly. "Where's it from?" Rick sighed, long and slow, like a man unsealing a door he had locked for years. "It's mine, Morty. It's something I wrote a long time ago. Back before all this." He waved vaguely at the garage, at the universe, at the mess of his life. "You wrote it." Morty's eyes widened. "But it doesn't sound like you. It's I dunno, soft, kinda beautiful." "Yeah, well, don't tell anyone." Rick snapped, but the bite in his voice was weak. He rubbed his forehead. "It wasn't for science. Wasn't for power. I wrote it for—" He cut himself off, swallowing hard. "For your mom. When she was little." Morty blinked. "Mom?" Rick's laugh was bitter, but there was no malice in it. "Yeah, Morty. Even geniuses have their moments. She couldn't sleep sometimes. I thought if I could give her something safe, maybe she'd dream easier. So I built that stupid device. Tried to catch songs from the cosmos, and when nothing worked, I wrote my own." "Pathetic, huh?" Morty shook his head slowly. "It's not pathetic, Rick. It's nice." "Nice," Rick echoed, rolling the word around like it was foreign. "Haven't been called that in a while." He tilted his head back against the boxes, eyes glassy but not from drink. "I hated it, Morty. I hated how it made me feel. Weak, exposed, so I buried it. Pretended it was just another failed experiment. Tried to drink it away." Morty sat beside him, unsure what to say. He had never seen Rick like this. Not defeated, not sarcastic, but raw, human. "You don't have to be ashamed of it," Morty said finally, voice soft. "It doesn't make you weak. It makes you, I dunno, real." Rick chuckled darkly. "Careful, Morty. You start calling me real, I might start crying, and nobody wants to see that." But despite the joke, his voice cracked. He turned the flask in his hand, then set it aside. For once, he didn't reach for it again. The two of them sat in silence. Not the heavy silence Rick hated, but something gentler. A silence that held the melody within it, like a heartbeat too quiet to hear but too steady to ignore. Finally, Rick spoke again, barely above a whisper. "I didn't want the world to hear it, Morty. Didn't want anyone to know I had that in me. But now it's out there. Can't stop it. Maybe it's a good thing." Morty said carefully. "The world could use more of it." Rick closed his eyes. For a long time, he didn't answer. Then, in the faintest voice Morty had ever heard from him, Rick admitted, "I just hope it doesn't break me to hear it again." Morty glanced at his grandfather. Not the loud, impossible genius, but the man beneath, sitting on the garage floor, vulnerable in the glow of a song he couldn't hide from anymore. And in that moment, Morty didn't see weakness. He saw strength, the kind that comes from finally letting yourself be known. The melody lingered between them, unspoken but undeniable. The song was never meant to leave the walls of Rick's garage, yet the quiet had its own way of carrying things, farther than invention ever could. It began softly, so softly no one could trace its first steps. A child humming it after overhearing Morty. A breeze that seemed to echo its rhythm. The gentle groan of a train on its tracks that fell into the same cadence. Small, invisible threads weaving the melody into the fabric of everyday life. At first, no one noticed. A tune here, a whisper there. But gradually, the world began to tilt toward it. As if everything had been waiting for this sound without knowing. Radios caught faint echoes in the static between stations. Old record players, untouched for years, seemed to hum along when dust was brushed from their surfaces. In kitchens, in parks, in cars idling at traffic lights, people found themselves humming a line they couldn't place, a phrase without words that belonged both to them and to no one. It was never loud. That was the strange part. Loudness had always ruled the earth, the blare of advertisements, the shouts of arguments, the ceaseless hum of machines. But this was quiet, and yet it spread further than all the noise. Quiet carried. Quiet lasted. Somewhere in the city, a mother paused while rocking her child. She realized she was humming something unfamiliar. The same lullaby she had heard faintly through her apartment walls when her neighbor played music the night before. She didn't know why, but it calmed the child faster than anything else. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and felt her own heart soften. On a distant coast, a fisherman rose before dawn, setting out onto still waters. As he rowed, he found himself tapping the oar against the boat in a rhythm that matched the melody carried faintly across the waves. He couldn't explain it, but the sea seemed to answer. The water was calm, the sky gentler, as if the world itself was singing back. Even the winds took part. High above the earth, where clouds drifted slow and aimless, the currents seemed to bend in time with the music. Birds flew in loose formations that curved along its rhythm. Leaves rustled not chaotically but in unison, a faint applause of nature. The song had grown beyond its source, becoming something larger than Rick's memory, larger than Morty's hum. It was no longer owned. It was shared. People began to feel it before they heard it. A barista, tired and impatient, felt a sudden calm as he handed a cup to a stranger and smiled without knowing why. A group of teenagers, restless and loud, found themselves quieting when one of them tapped out the tune against the side of a soda can. In offices, in schools, in crowded buses, the same thing happened. Small softening, subtle kindness. Nothing dramatic, just a gentle shift, like the world was exhaling after holding its breath too long. Rick noticed, of course. He pretended not to, but he couldn't miss it. The news didn't call it a song, but reports began to mention odd phenomena. Radio waves harmonizing across channels, shared dreams among strangers, an unexplainable rise in small acts of kindness. Scientists scratched their heads, philosophers speculated, and Rick rolled his eyes at all of them. He knew the truth. Morty, on the other hand, watched with quiet wonder. It was like carrying a secret and seeing it bloom everywhere. He heard children humming it while walking to school. He saw neighbors who barely spoke exchange small, genuine smiles. And though no one could trace it back to him, Morty felt like he was part of something extraordinary. Not because he owned it, but because he didn't. In one neighborhood, an elderly man stood at his window listening to the city's distant hum. He closed his eyes and wept softly, though he couldn't have told you why. In another, a woman who had been lonely for years found herself singing under her breath as she cooked, and for the first time in memory, she felt accompanied. The song wasn't healing everything. The world was still the world, full of grief, arguments, storms and silence that cut too deeply. But woven into all of it now was this strange melody, fragile and persistent. It didn't erase sorrow, but it reminded people of tenderness, and that reminder was enough to change the shape of their days. At night, the melody grew stronger, carried on dreams. People who had never met dreamed of the same tune, humming in their sleep. Some woke with tears on their cheeks, though they didn't know why. Others woke smiling. It didn't matter where you lived, how old you were, what language you spoke. The song belonged to everyone, and everyone belonged to it. Morty sat once again on the garage roof, sandwich in hand, listening to the distant hum. He didn't have to sing it now. The world was singing for him. He turned to Rick, who was leaning back with his flask, pretending to be bored. "You hear it, don't you?" Morty asked softly. Rick scoffed. "Of course I hear it, Morty. Can't exactly turn it off." He stared into the night sky, jaw tight. "World's going soft." Morty smiled faintly. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Rick didn't reply. But for just a moment, when Morty wasn't looking, he let his lips shape the melody, so quietly even the stars might have missed it, and the song spread further, across rivers, through crowded streets, into dreams and hearts. Quietly, endlessly, as though it had always been here. The world had taken the melody into itself. Morty could feel it everywhere he went. Like a current under the surface of daily life, subtle but steady. People weren't suddenly different. They still argued, still worried, still carried their private sorrows. But in small ways they softened. In glances exchanged on sidewalks. In strangers helping each other with heavy bags. In the way silence between people didn't feel as sharp. Morty watched it all quietly, unsure how something so small could ripple so far, and somewhere in the back of his mind, He knew Rick was watching too, though his grandfather pretended otherwise. Rick had admitted the truth of the song, admitted its origin, and in doing so had handed over something rare: vulnerability. Rick didn't trust the world with it. He barely trusted Morty with it. But that night, on the garage roof, as the song drifted through the sky like starlight, Rick made a choice. "Morty," Rick said suddenly, eyes on the horizon. "Yeah, Rick," Morty answered, brushing crumbs from his lap. Rick's voice was gruff, but there was something underneath, something almost careful. "Don't let it be mine anymore." Morty blinked. "What do you mean?" Rick shifted, uncomfortable. "I mean, I gave it to the wrong person once. Buried it after that. Didn't think I'd ever hear it again. Now it's out there, whether I like it or not. It's not mine anymore." "Can't be." "But you," he glanced at Morty, quickly, then back at the sky. "You can carry it. Keep it alive. You've got the heart for it. I don't." Morty's throat tightened. Rick didn't say things like this. He wasn't the type to pass on legacies. His inheritance was usually chaos, mistakes, unfinished projects. But this was different. "Rick," Morty started, but Rick cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Don't make it weird, Morty. I'm not saying it's some noble quest or anything. Just don't let it die. Don't let it turn into one of those things people forget. If you're gonna keep humming it, do it for them. For everyone, not for me." Morty sat there in silence, the weight of the request settling into his chest. He didn't know why, but it felt heavier than anything Rick had asked of him before. Not dangerous, not life-threatening, just heavy in a different way. "Okay," Morty said quietly. "I'll keep it." Rick grunted, as if that settled it. He took a swig from his flask and leaned back, but Morty caught the flicker of relief in his grandfather's expression. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. From that night forward, Morty thought of himself differently. Not as a hero, not as someone special, but as a kind of caretaker. Whenever he felt nervous or restless, he hummed the tune under his breath. At school, walking home, even waiting in line at the store, softly, quietly, like carrying a lantern through dark halls. And more often than not, he noticed others around him hum back, without realizing. It wasn't just imitation, it was resonance. He saw it when a classmate, who usually sat alone at lunch, joined a group after humming along unconsciously. He heard it when a teacher paused mid-lecture, caught herself smiling, and then continued in a calmer tone. Morty didn't tell anyone it was his. That wasn't the point. The song wasn't his to own, just his to keep alive. At night, he dreamed of it. The tune folded itself into his sleep, carrying him through landscapes of light and memory. Sometimes he saw his mother holding him as a baby, rocking gently. Sometimes he saw Rick, younger, less weary, writing notes in the dark. Sometimes he saw nothing at all, just stars pulsing softly to the rhythm. Each dream left him calmer than when he entered it. Even Summer noticed. One afternoon, she nudged him while they sat in the living room. "You're different, Morty. Calmer. Like you're carrying some secret around." Morty shrugged, but he couldn't hide his small smile. "Maybe I am." Summer rolled her eyes, but she smiled too. Morty didn't need to explain. The melody was explanation enough. Rick, meanwhile, pretended to ignore it all. He kept tinkering in the garage, kept making his usual noise, but every so often, when he thought no one was around, Morty would hear him pause. Just for a second. Just long enough for the hum of the song to brush against his silence, and then Rick would return to his tools, more restless than before. But Morty understood. Rick had given up ownership, but he hadn't stopped listening. Morty felt both young and old carrying this legacy. Too young to understand its full weight, too old now to shrug it off. Yet he didn't resent it. If anything, it gave him a sense of purpose he had never known before. Not a destiny, not a mission, just a quiet role, to be the keeper of something fragile that made the world a little softer. And as he lay in bed one night, drifting into sleep, the song weaving around him like a blanket, Morty realized something. The world didn't need heroes with powers or weapons. It didn't need Rick's brilliance or his inventions. Sometimes all it needed was a tune, hummed softly enough that even the loneliest heart could hear it. He smiled to himself, the last thought before sleep taking shape as a promise. I'll keep it safe. I'll keep it alive. And somewhere in the garage, Rick, half asleep at his workbench, murmured the same tune under his breath, almost as if to answer. Morty had always thought of heroes as loud figures, people who fought battles, shouted commands, stood in spotlights. Heroes in movies, in comics, even in Rick's strange, dangerous adventures were defined by explosions, victories, and the kind of noise that filled a room. But as he walked through his days now, carrying the song in his chest, Morty realized the truth was different. His journey wasn't about saving worlds in spectacular ways. It was about small things unnoticed by most. It was about humming a melody in places where silence had grown too sharp, where people forgot tenderness. It was about being patient in a moment of frustration, kind when no one asked for it. He didn't even know if anyone else saw it, but he could feel the ripple, quiet and steady. At school, he hummed while waiting for class to begin. The sound was low, nearly inaudible, but enough that the students sitting nearby caught it. One girl who often looked down at her desk lifted her head, her lips moving faintly in time. A boy who usually tapped his pencil in irritation stopped, listening instead. The teacher entered more calmly than usual, and for the first time in weeks, the room didn't feel heavy with boredom. Morty didn't say a word, he just hummed. Later at the store, he stood behind an older man fumbling with coins at the register. People in line sighed, impatient. Morty started humming, barely louder than a breath. The man smiled faintly as he counted. The cashier's shoulders relaxed, and even the sighing stopped. No one noticed Morty. They didn't need to. The song worked in the background, invisible but present. He thought about Rick sometimes when he hummed. Rick, who had given up ownership of the melody. Rick, who carried so much noise inside him that softness felt like a betrayal. Morty wondered if his grandfather knew how far the song had gone now, how deeply it was threading itself through ordinary lives. Maybe he knew. Maybe that was why Rick stayed in the garage longer than usual, drowning in static. But Morty couldn't stop it. The song wasn't about Rick anymore. It wasn't even about Morty. It was about everyone who needed a small reminder that the world could be gentle. One afternoon, Morty sat in the park, watching children play. He hummed as he fed crumbs to the birds. A small boy nearby started humming back, not even aware he was copying. Soon another child joined in, then another. The melody circled the playground like wind through leaves. Parents paused in their conversations, tilting their heads, smiling without reason. Morty closed his eyes, listening. The song didn't belong to him anymore, and that was the point. It wasn't all perfect. Morty still had bad days. Days when he felt invisible, when homework piled up, when arguments at home made the walls too thin. But even then, the song was there, humming quietly in his chest. It reminded him that softness could survive inside sharpness, that he could be small and still matter. That his journey wasn't about changing the whole world at once, but about being one gentle note in its vast, messy music. At night, he dreamed of carrying a lantern. The lantern wasn't bright, not enough to light the whole path, but it was steady. In the dream, strangers passed him, and each time they looked at the lantern, they lit one of their own. Soon the path wasn't dark anymore, not because of him, but because everyone carried their own small flame. When he woke, Morty realized that was exactly what the song was doing. He wasn't the hero, everyone was. He was just the keeper, the reminder. He told no one about these thoughts. Not even Summer, not even Rick. He didn't need to. They would feel it, eventually, in their own way. Rick still muttered about the world going soft, but Morty noticed the edge in his voice wasn't as sharp. Summer rolled her eyes at Morty's secretive smile, but found herself humming unconsciously when she did homework. Even Jerry, awkward and fumbling, caught himself singing a line of it in the shower, embarrassed but somehow lighter afterward. Morty didn't fight villains. He didn't carry weapons. His hero's journey was quieter than that, humbler. He carried a tune that softened strangers, that drifted through houses, that entered dreams, and left people gentler than before. And for the first time in his life, Morty didn't feel like he had to be more than that. On the roof one evening, as the sky bruised into twilight, Morty hummed again. Birds circled overhead, their wings catching the fading light. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked once and then quieted, as if listening. Morty didn't need applause, didn't need recognition. The song was enough. The journey was enough. For in the quiet, Morty realized there was a kind of heroism no one had ever shown him before. The courage to be gentle in a world that often wasn't. And that courage, though invisible, could change everything. He leaned back, hands folded behind his head, and let the melody rise into the night sky, trusting it to go where it was needed. Rick sat alone in the garage, the faint hum of his machines filling the silence. The air smelled of metal, solder, and the faint sharpness of spilled alcohol drying on the workbench. In front of him lay pieces of inventions half finished, wires dangling like veins, notes scattered across the table. All of it looked purposeful, brilliant, chaotic. But none of it, not even the wildest ideas, could reach the strange quiet that had settled in the world since the song returned. He poured another drink, watching the liquid swirl in his glass. Normally he would drown out his thoughts with noise, with gadgets sparking, with rants, with portals snapping open to somewhere new. But the quiet refused to leave. Even the machines seemed to hum in tune with that melody, as if mocking him. Rick had spent his whole life building things that were loud, explosive, undeniable. Machines to break barriers, weapons to defeat enemies, devices to bend the rules of existence. He had been proud of that noise, convinced it was strength. Yet here he was, watching Earth calm itself with something softer than science, a lullaby he once tried to bury. He hated it. He needed it. Both truths lived inside him, tangled. He remembered the night he first wrote the song. His hands weren't holding tools then. No wrenches, no circuits, no formula scribbled across endless notebooks. Instead, he had been sitting quietly with a guitar in his lap. Something dusty and old he hadn't touched in years. His fingers moved clumsily at first, but slowly the notes fell into place. The melody arrived like a visitor at the door, uninvited but welcome. He hadn't written it for discovery, or for invention, or to impress anyone. He had written it because his heart hurt. And words weren't enough. He thought of her. The person he had once loved enough to show that song to. He never let himself say her name anymore. Saying it would make her real again, too real, and the ache would split him open. But he remembered the way her eyes softened when she heard it, the way she said nothing, and everything at once, by resting her hand on his. For a brief moment, Rick had been seen, not as the genius or the drunk, but as something tender. That memory haunted him more than any failure in the lab. He had buried the song after she was gone. Buried it under experiments, under adventures, under bottle after bottle. He told himself it didn't matter. He convinced himself that softness was weakness, that tenderness was dangerous. The universe was sharp, and if you weren't sharper, you would be cut apart. But now the universe hummed the tune back to him. Rick set his glass down and rubbed his forehead. His whole career, his whole existence, had been about bending the universe to his will. But this was different. This was the universe bending him. It wasn't fair. Science had been his language, his weapon, his pride. Yet here he was, watching Earth heal not through genius equations or portals, but through something embarrassingly simple. A melody, a softness, a whisper carried on the wind. The world didn't need his machines right now. It needed the one thing he had always been ashamed of giving. The regret pressed heavier than any hangover. He thought of Morty, wandering through his days humming, spreading the tune without even realizing the scope of it. Morty wasn't clever like him, wasn't inventive, wasn't hardened by interdimensional wars. Morty was just soft, ordinary, and somehow that was exactly what the world needed. Rick smirked bitterly at the thought. The greatest scientist alive, outdone by a kid with a melody in his chest. He wanted to laugh, but his throat caught instead. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He wondered how many times in his life he had traded softness for noise. How many chances he had ruined because he believed noise was strength. He wondered what would have happened if he had let himself keep playing that song, if he had allowed himself to believe that gentleness could survive in a cruel universe. For a long while, he said nothing. The machines hummed. His drink grew warm. The garage smelled of wires and quiet regret. And then, almost without realizing it, Rick began to hum. Just a fragment, low and broken. His voice cracked on the notes, but it was enough. The sound filled the room, fragile, vulnerable. For a moment, he didn't feel like a scientist. He didn't feel like a genius. He didn't even feel like Rick Sanchez, destroyer of universes. He felt like a man who once loved, who once played a song, who once hoped that maybe, just maybe, the world could be softer. The regret didn't disappear. It never would. But in that hum, in that fragile note trembling through the garage, he felt something shift. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe the song wasn't mocking him. Maybe it was forgiving him. Rick closed his eyes, his voice falling into silence again. He reached for his drink but didn't take a sip. Instead, he sat quietly, listening to the echo of his own hum, letting the regret ache, letting it breathe. The universe was softer now, and for the first time in a long while, Rick allowed himself to be softened with it. Jerry never thought of himself as the kind of person who mattered much. He was the man who misplaced keys, who forgot the right words in arguments, who stumbled when he wanted to appear steady. He was the one who always felt like an afterthought, even in his own home. Rick made him feel small with a single look. Summer rolled her eyes at him more often than not. Even Morty, in his clumsy affection, seemed more important, more essential. But the song didn't treat him that way. He heard it first in the quietest of moments. Early morning, when the house was still and the light through the curtains was pale and sleepy. Jerry had been standing in the kitchen, waiting for the coffee to drip, staring blankly at the slow stream filling the pot. He didn't even notice he was humming at first. The tune slipped past his lips, soft and awkward, like a secret sneaking out, and yet it fit. The song wrapped around him the way a blanket might, not loud, not impressive, but steady, warm. Jerry's voice cracked, uneven, a little off-key, but still, he kept humming. For once, he didn't care if it was perfect. Later, in the car on the way to work, he found himself singing again, this time under his breath. Traffic was heavy, the kind that usually frayed his nerves, but instead of gripping the wheel with frustration, Jerry let the melody carry him. His shoulders eased, his heartbeat slowed, the honks around him faded into background noise. The world was still chaotic, but for once he didn't feel swallowed by it. At work, he sat through another meeting where his ideas were ignored, where voices overlapped his, where he sank into silence because it felt easier. But when he left the room, walking down the hall with his head lowered, he hummed the tune again. And in that small act, he didn't feel as invisible. The song reminded him that being unseen didn't mean being worthless. That evening, when Beth came home tired, Jerry was waiting with dinner on the table. It wasn't fancy, just sandwiches, thrown together with what they had. But he placed them carefully, humming as he moved around the kitchen. Beth looked at him strangely at first, as if waiting for the punchline, the inevitable clumsy mistake. But then her expression softened. She sat down, listening quietly while Jerry moved from counter to chair. He didn't even realize he was still humming, but Beth noticed. She didn't say anything, only smiled faintly, as though hearing something familiar she couldn't quite place. Jerry's chest swelled with a kind of pride he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't loud. It wasn't heroic. But it was enough. The song followed him even into the most ordinary corners of his life. Folding laundry, walking the dog, waiting at the gas pump while the meter clicked upward. Each time, Jerry hummed. Each time, the act seemed to matter more than he understood. One night, as he sat alone in the living room, the family scattered across their own routines, Jerry picked up his old guitar from the corner. Dust clung to it, the strings slightly out of tune. He strummed gently, clumsily, almost afraid of the sound. And then, slowly, the melody wove its way through his fingers. It wasn't perfect. In fact, it was barely music at all, rough and halting. But Jerry felt something he hadn't in years, that he was part of something larger. The song didn't belong to him, but in that moment it didn't exclude him either. For once, he wasn't the mistake. He was a note in the melody, however awkward, however small. He played until his hands ached. No one came to listen. No one needed to. The song wasn't about applause. It was about feeling present in the world, about believing that even a man who lost track of his own sentences could carry a tune that mattered. Later, in bed, Jerry lay awake beside Beth. He whispered the melody softly, almost like a prayer. Beth stirred, not waking, but shifting closer, her breathing slowing into rhythm with his quiet hum. Jerry stared at the ceiling, the ache in his chest loosening, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt like a man who could keep something alive, even if it was just a song. He smiled into the dark. It was a small smile, hesitant but real. Jerry knew he would never be Rick, never be Morty, never be Summer or Beth. He would never be brilliant, never be adventurous, never be sharp enough to cut through the noise. But he didn't need to be. Because the song didn't ask for brilliance. It asked for softness. And Jerry, in his awkward, stumbling way, had more softness than anyone else in the room. For once, that felt like enough. The first time people noticed it, the sky looked ordinary. Blue stretched out above them, clouds drifting lazily as they always had. Airplanes carved faint lines in the distance. The sun warmed rooftops, and birds traced arcs between trees. But hidden inside that ordinary sky was something no one could quite name. When they tilted their heads back, when they allowed themselves a moment of stillness, they swore they could hear it, a tune, carried on the wind, threaded into the clouds. It wasn't loud, it was never loud. It was the kind of sound you might almost mistake for silence. Until you realized silence never felt this comforting. The clouds seemed to hum, as if they had swallowed the melody Morty carried, and decided to keep it safe in their drifting bodies. People walking home from work paused at stoplights, looking upward with puzzled smiles. Children pointed to the sky without knowing why. Lovers sitting on benches leaned closer, hearing something soft above their own words. Morty noticed it one evening, lying on the roof again with a sandwich in his hand. He hummed as always, but this time, when he stopped to chew, the sound didn't stop with him. It went on, higher, wider, beyond his own breath. He sat up, squinting at the clouds turning pink with sunset. They weren't just floating. They were singing back. He whispered, almost to himself, "Rick, it's in the sky now." Rick didn't answer. He was somewhere below, pretending not to listen, tools clinking in the garage. But Morty knew he felt it too. Everyone did. The clouds carried the song across oceans and mountains. Pilots swore their cabins grew calmer mid-flight. Farmers paused in their fields, hearing faint notes in the rustle of crops. Even in crowded cities, where noise pressed in from every angle, people swore the clouds above seemed to breathe a kind of music. For once, the sky wasn't distant or indifferent. It was present, tender, singing without words. Children, especially, heard it best. They sat by windows at night, whispering the tune back to the stars. They hummed it in playgrounds, letting it follow the arc of swings and the creak of seesaws. Parents found themselves comforted without explanation, watching their kids fall asleep more peacefully than before. The clouds had become a lullaby the whole world could share. Jerry, walking the dog late one night, looked up and froze. The melody poured down so softly he felt like it was meant only for him. His awkward voice joined in before he realized it, the dog tugging gently at the leash. He laughed at himself, embarrassed, but he didn't stop singing. No one was there to hear but the stars, and somehow that was enough. Beth, exhausted after a long shift, rolled down her car window on the drive home. The cool air touched her face, and with it, she heard the faint hum. For the first time in weeks, she let her shoulders rest against the seat, her breath falling into rhythm with the melody. She didn't know where it came from, didn't even question it. She just let herself belong to it. And Rick, though he never admitted it, stood outside the garage longer than usual, staring at the sky. He muttered to himself, pretending it was just weather, just wind. But deep down, he recognized the truth. The universe had picked up something he had once discarded. It was carrying it farther than he ever could. It wasn't science. It wasn't invention. It was softness, diffused into the clouds, returning to him whether he liked it or not. The song had become weather now. It moved with the air, shifting with storms, stretching with the seasons. In spring, it whispered through blossoms. In summer, it hung heavy in warm nights. In autumn, it brushed through falling leaves. And in winter, it lingered in the hush of snow. People forgot to call it a song, but they still felt it. They felt it in the way the sky seemed closer, kinder, less lonely. Morty, watching all of this unfold, felt both small and proud. He hadn't meant for it to go so far. He had only wanted to keep the melody alive, to honor it. Now it was everywhere, carried beyond his reach. He realized that was the point. It was never his to own. Songs, once sung, belonged to the world. Lying under the drifting shapes, Morty whispered, "Don't stop." And the clouds, in their endless patience, answered with silence that felt like music. The world had grown softer, not in a dramatic way, but in ways that mattered most. Strangers pausing to hold open doors, neighbors checking on each other, families sharing meals a little more gently. The sky sang above it all, reminding people, without words, that tenderness was real, and it was theirs to carry. The lullaby had no beginning anyone could recall, no ending anyone could predict. It was just there, stretched across the sky like a promise too quiet to break. And somewhere, Rick lit a cigarette, looking up at the clouds with a tired smirk. "She stupid song," he muttered. But he didn't go back inside, not yet. He stayed, letting the smoke drift upward, blending with the hum. The clouds kept singing. The world kept listening, and the melody, fragile and eternal, rose higher than anyone's doubts. Time moved softly, like pages turning in a book you didn't realize you were reading. Morty didn't notice himself growing older at first. The days still felt familiar, walking down hallways, riding in cars, sitting at the roof's edge with a sandwich in hand. But slowly, quietly, the boy who hummed to himself began to change. His voice deepened, his shoulders broadened, his steps steadied. He was still Morty, still shy and uncertain, but there was something else now. A gentleness that grew stronger as the years unfolded. The song never left him. Through exams, through heartbreaks, through days of doubt, it was always there like a lantern in his chest. At first he hummed it nervously, like a secret he didn't want discovered. But as he grew older, he carried it without fear. Not loudly, never loudly, but with a calm certainty, as though it belonged to him as much as his own heartbeat. People noticed, though they didn't always understand. Friends leaned closer when he spoke, as if his words carried a quiet comfort. Strangers smiled at him without knowing why. In coffee shops, on buses, in classrooms, Morty's presence seemed to soften the edges of the room. It wasn't charisma, not in the usual sense. It was something quieter, deeper, like the melody still echoing in the air around him. One summer evening, Morty sat with Summer on the porch. They hadn't done that in years. Just sat together, no screens, no distractions, listening to cicadas buzzing in the twilight. Summer, usually sharp and restless, leaned her head back against the railing. "You've changed," she said, almost absently. "Not in a bad way. Just you're calmer. Like you know something the rest of us don't." Morty didn't answer right away. He hummed instead, soft and steady, the notes threading into the humid air. Summer closed her eyes. For a moment, the siblings were children again, safe in a house that had so often felt unstable, listening to something that promised they'd always have each other. Morty didn't say the words out loud, but he knew Summer heard them in the melody. I'm here. You're not alone. Years passed, and Morty carried the song into each season of his life. He worked, he studied, he stumbled and learned. He made mistakes, but he met them differently now. He didn't fight so hard to prove himself. He didn't crumble as easily under pressure. The melody inside him reminded him of patience, of kindness, of softness, things he once thought were weaknesses but now recognized as strengths. Sometimes he caught Rick watching him, not with the sharp criticism of before, but with something more complicated. Pride maybe. Regret definitely. Rick never said anything, but Morty knew his grandfather saw it, the boy growing into a man, carrying a tune that Rick had long ago abandoned. Morty hoped it gave Rick some peace, even if Rick would never admit it. In time, Morty found himself teaching without trying. A child bumped into him on the street, apologizing with wide, nervous eyes. Morty bent down, smiled, and hummed a few notes as if to say, "It's okay." The child's shoulders loosened. A coworker, overwhelmed by deadlines, sat with Morty at lunch. He didn't give advice. He just hummed. The coworker breathed easier afterward. He began to realize the song wasn't just music anymore. It was a way of moving through the world. It was in the way he held doors open, the way he listened without rushing to reply, the way he looked at people as if they mattered. Really mattered. He didn't need to tell them the origin of the tune, didn't need to explain. The song had grown beyond stories, beyond words. It was something felt more than known. At night, Morty would sometimes return to the roof, looking at the stars. The clouds still carried the melody, whispering above him, endless and gentle. He would lie back, older now, eyes half closed, and hum along. It felt like harmony, as though he had grown into the same rhythm the universe had chosen. He wondered, sometimes, what legacy meant. People always talked about grand gestures, about being remembered for brilliance or achievement. But Morty saw it differently. Legacy, to him, was leaving the world softer than you found it. If the song lived on, through his hum, through the clouds, through strangers passing it to each other without knowing, then that was enough. Rick once told him, half drunk in the garage, "You'll never be a genius, Morty. And that's fine. The world doesn't need another me." Morty had only smiled, humming under his breath. Rick had rolled his eyes, but Morty caught the ghost of a smile flickering on his face. He carried those moments with him as he stepped into adulthood. The boy who once felt clumsy, lost, always behind, now carried something steady, something eternal. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to fight to be important. His importance was quiet, like the song itself, spread in ripples too subtle to measure, but too deep to deny. Morty grew up, but the melody remained, not as a burden, not as a secret, but as a part of him, like breath, like heartbeat, like the sky above, endlessly patient. And as the years unfolded, Morty realized the truth: some songs don't end when childhood does. Some songs grow with you, softening the years, guiding your steps. They become the shape of who you are. Morty had grown up, but the song was still humming, eternal, as though time itself had decided to sing along. Rick had always been a man of motion, portals opening, engines roaring, universes bending beneath his hands. He didn't sit still, he didn't watch. Watching to him had always felt like weakness, like admitting the world could move without him. Yet as the years passed and Morty grew taller, steadier, softer, Rick found himself in the strange position of being an observer. He didn't announce it. He would never say, "I'm proud of you, Morty." The words caught like splinters in his throat. Instead, he stayed in the background, half hidden in garages, shadows, doorways. He saw more than Morty ever realized. He saw Morty pause to listen when someone else spoke, Instead of rushing to fill silence with nervous words, he saw Morty hold open doors, carry groceries for strangers, let children cut ahead in line. Small things, unremarkable by most standards, but they mattered. They were echoes of that damn song, rippling outward, reshaping the world in quiet ways. Rick, with all his genius, had never managed to do that. His inventions changed physics, tore through galaxies, collapsed timelines, but they didn't soften hearts. They didn't make the universe kinder. Morty, without even trying, had done something Rick never could. He made people gentler simply by being himself. Late at night, Rick would step outside with a drink in hand, pretending he only needed air. He'd find Morty sitting on the roof, older now, humming as he always had. Sometimes Rick would hover in the shadows, just far enough that Morty wouldn't notice, letting the tune thread through him like smoke. He'd scoff under his breath, mutter about stupid sentimentality, and yet, he never walked away. There was something in Morty's steadiness that Rick envied. The boy, no, the man now, carried his softness like a lantern, never letting the world harden it out of him. Rick had lost his own lantern long ago. He had traded it for equations, for noise, for inventions that filled the silence but never eased it. Watching Morty reminded him of what he had thrown away. And yet, instead of bitterness, Rick felt something else creep in. Something uncomfortable, foreign, pride. He never said it out loud. When others asked, he still called Morty an idiot, still rolled his eyes, still groaned when Morty forgot simple things. But in the quiet of his own mind, Rick admitted what he would never say. Morty had become more than he expected. More than Rick deserved. There was a night Rick remembered clearly. Morty had fallen asleep on the couch, humming faintly even in his dreams. The television glowed with muted colors, the room dim except for the flicker of light across Morty's peaceful face. Rick stood in the doorway for longer than he meant to. The boy he had once dragged into chaos was now a man carrying peace wherever he went. Rick whispered, too low for anyone to hear, "Good job, kid." Then he turned away before the words could sting too much. In another moment, Rick watched Morty comfort a child in the park. No invention, no device, no brilliance, just a quiet hum, a hand on a small shoulder. The child smiled, the fear gone from their face. Rick felt his chest ache, realizing the truth he had fought all along. Morty's way of saving the world was stronger than his own. Not louder, not sharper. Stronger because it asked nothing, demanded nothing, only gave. From afar, Rick carried his own regrets. He wondered how things might have been if he had embraced softness earlier, if he had believed in the power of that lullaby, instead of drowning it in alcohol. He wondered if the people he had lost might have stayed, if he'd dared to sing more and invent less. But regrets didn't change the past, they only haunted the present, so Rick watched. It was all he could allow himself to do. One evening, Morty caught him. The younger man turned from the roof, eyes meeting Rick's shadow below. "You don't have to hide, you know," Morty said softly. "You can sit with me." Rick smirked, pretending the words didn't land. "What, and join your little sing-along club?" "Not my style, Morty." But Morty only smiled, humming again as if to answer without argument. Rick lingered longer than he should have, muttering under his breath, pretending to be annoyed. Yet when he finally walked away, the tune stayed with him, rattling in his chest like something half forgotten, half forgiven. Watching from afar became Rick's quiet ritual. He'd never stop inventing, never stop building, never stop filling his days with noise. But at night, when the house was still, he'd let himself notice Morty's growth. He'd let himself feel that flicker of pride. And though he never joined in, he always listened. Maybe Rick thought that was enough. For some men, love could never be spoken. For some, it could only be witnessed. In the hum of a lullaby, carried by someone braver, softer, kinder. Rick didn't know how long he'd be around. But he knew, as he watched from afar, that Morty would carry the song long after he was gone. And in that truth, Rick found something he had never expected to feel again: peace. The years slipped by the way they always do, quietly, without permission. Summer grew older, her sharp edges softening into something wiser, steadier. She no longer stormed against the world with restless defiance. Instead, she learned to sit with it, to let it move like a tide around her. And in her home, in the warmth of quiet evenings, her children began to hum. It started small, the way most gentle things do. Her daughter, half asleep in bed, whispered a tune Summer hadn't realized she remembered. A fragile string of notes, barely there, but carrying something deeper than sound. It was the lullaby Rick had once hidden, the melody Morty had carried, the song that had seeped into the very air of Earth itself. Summer froze at the doorway, hand on the frame, listening. The child's voice drifted into the dark room, like light leaking under a door. She wanted to ask, "Where did you learn that?" But she didn't. Some things aren't taught. Some things just live, passed along like breath, as natural as closing one's eyes at night. Later, her son would hum the same tune while drawing by the window. No one had instructed him either. He claimed he heard it in the clouds, that when the sky turned pink at sunset, the music pressed softly against his heart. Summer didn't doubt him. She'd felt it too, all her life. Those faint notes rising from air, from memory, from something larger than language. Her children carried the melody like they carried her hair color, or Rick's stubbornness. Something inherited without explanation. It became part of their play. They'd sing fragments while building forts, hum while scribbling on paper, let the lullaby fill the silences between laughter. For Summer, it was strange and beautiful. She remembered when the family had been broken, jagged, filled with sharp words and slammed doors. Yet here, in this later chapter of her life, she watched something impossible. Her children weaving peace from the very same family thread that had once tangled in chaos. Sometimes, she would sit at the edge of their beds, watching their small chests rise and fall as they drifted to sleep, the song tumbling softly from their lips. She didn't cry, though her throat tightened. Instead, she smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead, whispering the same lullaby under her breath. She hadn't realized how deeply she'd needed to hear it again, not just from Morty or from the wind, but from her own children, proof that love could carry across generations, stubborn as light. Rick never spoke of it. But Summer noticed that when he visited, the children seemed to hum louder, as if some part of them sensed that the melody had been born from him. Rick would roll his eyes, mutter about annoying repetition, but his hands always shook a little when he poured his drink. Summer didn't call him out on it. She didn't need to. She saw the way his eyes softened, just for a moment, before he turned away. What struck Summer most was how unself-conscious her children were with the tune. They never guarded it, never doubted it, never questioned if it was too soft, too vulnerable. To them, it was as natural as breathing. And in that ease, Summer realized something important. The world had changed. Her children didn't carry the same fear of tenderness that she and Morty once had. They lived in a gentler place, one where softness wasn't shameful, but celebrated. On a quiet afternoon, her daughter asked, "Mom, did you used to sing this when you were little?" Summer hesitated. She didn't want to tell the whole story. The pain, the regrets, Rick's silence, Morty's quiet burden, those things belonged to the older world, the heavier one. So instead, she simply said, "Yes, I did, and I'm glad you remember it now." The girl smiled, satisfied, and hummed herself back into her drawing. Summer listened, tears prickling her eyes, realizing that sometimes the simplest answer is the truest. The melody began to ripple outward again. Summer's children sang it to friends during sleepovers, passing it along like a secret handshake. Teachers caught themselves humming it after recess, not sure where they'd heard it. Strangers on the street whistled it absent-mindedly. It was spreading once more, not by design, not by invention, but by the same quiet current that had always carried it, love, unnoticed but unstoppable. At night, when the house was still, Summer sometimes heard all of it at once. the faint hum of her son down the hall, the whisper of her daughter, and her own voice beneath it all. 3 threads of one song, layered softly, filling the darkness with warmth. She thought of her grandfather then, alone in his garage, humming to himself in secret. She wished he could have seen this. Maybe he did. Maybe somewhere, somehow, Rick was listening. Summer realized the truth as she watched her children sleep. The song had outlived all their fears. It had moved beyond one man's shame, beyond one family's brokenness. It had become something eternal, woven into the quiet fabric of the world. And her children were proof, living, breathing, humming proof, that tenderness survives. She whispered into the dark, not sure if she was speaking to her kids, to Morty, or to the stars themselves. Remember this, remember softness. Don't ever let the world take it away from you. Her children stirred but did not wake. Their breathing steadied, the lullaby still on their lips, and Summer, for the first time in years, felt completely at peace. Because she knew, without needing to ask, that the song would never die. By then, the song no longer belonged to Rick, or Morty, or even Summer's children. It had become something freer, something larger. It moved like weather across the earth, humming through forests and cities, weaving into the rhythm of tides, catching on the wings of migrating birds. But Earth was never the limit. The universe has a way of listening when something true is sung, and the stars themselves began to respond. Astronomers noticed first, though they didn't understand what they were seeing. Certain constellations shimmered in ways they hadn't before. Patterns of light that seemed to pulse, almost like breath. Satellites recorded strange waves, too delicate to be radio static, too structured to be noise. It was as though the cosmos had found a harmony to join, but beyond the instruments and theories, people simply felt it. When they lay under the night sky, gazing upward in silence, they swore the stars were humming. A faint resonance in the bones, in the heart, in the space between breaths. It wasn't imagination. It was connection. The universe was listening, and in listening, it sang back. Morty noticed it most of all. Now older, carrying lines at the edges of his eyes, he sat one evening in the grass with no one around. He let his mind wander, humming the familiar notes, softer now, less certain. For a moment, he thought he was alone, but then he stopped, and the sound continued. Not from his lips, not from his lungs, but from the sky itself. He tilted his head, wide-eyed, realizing the truth. The stars were echoing him, or maybe he was echoing them. He couldn't tell where the song began or ended anymore, and maybe that was the point. Rick, of course, dismissed it with his usual sneer. Stars don't sing, Morty. That's just atmospheric interference, cosmic background radiation, your brain trying to make sense of noise. But even as he scoffed, he lingered a little longer outside at night. He'd tip his flask to the constellations and mutter curses under his breath, only to fall quiet when the hush of the song pressed against him. He never admitted it, not to Morty, not to anyone. But in his chest, he felt it too. The universe had always seemed indifferent to Rick, vast and cold, a playground for equations and nothing more. But now, in his older years, it was as if the cosmos itself leaned closer. Not to punish, not to reward, just to listen. For a man who had filled his life with noise, the silence that followed felt almost merciful. Meanwhile, on Earth, people everywhere began noticing small shifts. Farmers swore their fields grew more gently under starlight. Sailors said the seas seemed calmer when they hummed under their breath. Children claimed they dreamed more vividly, filled with glowing constellations that whispered lullabies. Nobody had proof, not the kind Rick trusted, but nobody seemed to need it. The experience was enough. Summer's children were the first to say it aloud. The stars know our song, and perhaps that was the truest sentence spoken in years. Rick sat in the garage one late evening, alone as usual, staring at a half-finished project he didn't care about. The hum was faint outside, drifting through the cracked window, threading through the night air. He closed his eyes, and for once, he didn't fight it. He let it wash over him, filling the spaces alcohol couldn't reach. He wondered if the universe wasn't listening to him after all. But to Morty, to Summer, to the children, to every human heart that dared to hum the tune, maybe the universe wasn't responding to Rick at all. And strangely, that comforted him. He thought back to the first time he had ever written it. The clumsy strumming of an instrument he'd never mastered, the awkward rush of tenderness he had never allowed himself to feel again. He'd buried it, denied it, cursed it. But now it had returned, unstoppable, flowing not from him but through him, into the skies, into the stars. The song was no longer his weakness. It was Earth's strength. Morty, lying awake one night, whispered to the darkness, "It feels like the stars are remembering us." He didn't mean humans, not entirely. He meant their kindness, their softness, their capacity for tenderness. The things the universe so rarely sees and so often forgets. The stars twinkled brighter at that moment, as if in agreement. It didn't save the world from chaos, from wars, from storms. Life still carried its pain, its messiness. But the song stitched something gentle through it all, a reminder that even in a cold, expanding universe, warmth could be found. It didn't erase sorrow. It simply gave people a way to carry it without breaking. Rick never admitted this aloud, but one evening, staring at the galaxy through his telescope, he muttered, "Fine. Maybe softness does matter. Maybe it's the only thing that ever did." The stars, indifferent and eternal, twinkled on. But somewhere in their shimmering, if one listened closely enough, there was the faintest echo of a lullaby. Not Rick's, not Morty's, not Earth's. The universe's own voice, carrying the melody forward. And so, the song lived on, between earth and sky, between breath and silence, between the living and the eternal. A conversation without end. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories. Years folded into one another, quietly, almost kindly, and Morty found himself standing at the edge of a life that felt both fleeting and impossibly long. He was no longer the stumbling boy dragged through portals, frightened and overwhelmed. He had grown into someone slower, steadier, a man who had learned to carry tenderness like a secret flame. The world around him had shifted too, calmer, quieter, though not without its storms. And yet, threaded through it all, the song remained. It was everywhere now. On city streets, strangers hummed it without knowing its origin. In the countryside, farmers whistled it while walking the fields. Lovers sang it softly to one another. Children drifted to sleep with it on their lips. The song had outgrown its beginning. It no longer belonged to a single moment, or a single family, or even a single planet. It belonged to everyone, and in that belonging, it had become eternal. And still, Morty kept it close in his own way, sitting on porches at dusk, walking home under lamplight, rocking gently in an old chair with a cup of tea. He would hum it, not loudly, not seeking notice, just enough to remind himself of the boy he once was, and the man he had become. Sometimes when he closed his eyes, he would see Rick, half in shadow, half in light. Not the wild, chaotic Rick who raged against the universe, but the quieter version, the one who lingered at the edges, listening. Morty would remember those rooftop nights, sandwiches in hand, Rick pretending not to care. He'd remember the way Rick froze when he first heard the tune, the rare vulnerability that had flickered in his eyes. Morty knew Rick would never have said it plainly. That wasn't who he was. But Morty had learned to listen to the spaces between Rick's words, to the pauses, the smirks, the way he always stayed just a little longer than he needed to. Rick had cared. He had cared more than he allowed himself to admit, and that, Morty realized, was enough. Now, as the song echoed through the world, Morty carried no bitterness for Rick's silence. He carried gratitude. Gratitude for the melody Rick had given, however reluctantly. Gratitude for the bond they had shared, messy, imperfect, painful, but real. Gratitude that, even in Rick's most broken moments, he had planted a seed of tenderness that outlived them both. One evening, Morty sat beneath a sky shimmering with stars. The air was cool, the kind of night that invites reflection. He thought about his childhood, about adventures he hadn't wanted, but which had shaped him anyway. He thought about Rick's mistakes, his brilliance, his regrets. He thought about how easy it was to forget softness in a world that demanded so much hardness. And yet, somehow, they hadn't forgotten. The song had seen to that. Morty closed his eyes, let the melody roll gently from his lips. It was softer now than when he was young, but perhaps more true for it. He hummed until his chest loosened, until his breath slowed, until the stars above seemed to hum back. And in that moment, he felt something like closure, not a dramatic ending, not a final word, but a gentle exhale. The kind of goodbye that doesn't shatter, but soothes. He whispered into the night, not sure who he was speaking to, Rick, Summer, the universe, or himself. It's okay now. We're okay. And in the silence that followed, the wind carried the lullaby onward. It slipped between trees, over rooftops, across rivers and mountains, joining the countless other voices that sang it without knowing why. It was the song of softness, the song of remembering. Morty opened his eyes and smiled faintly. He didn't need Rick to be beside him. He didn't need anyone to acknowledge what he had carried. The melody itself was acknowledgement enough, proof that tenderness doesn't vanish when people do. It lingers, it grows, it saves the world in ways no invention ever could. As he rose to leave, Morty turned back to look at the horizon one last time. The stars were bright, shimmering like notes scattered across an endless sheet of music. Somewhere out there, he imagined, Rick was still humming, alone, stubborn, unwilling to admit it, but humming all the same. And with that thought, Morty let out a long, gentle sigh, the kind that empties the chest and fills it all at once. A goodbye, and not a goodbye. Just an exhale into the night. Every song, people believe, must have an ending, a final note, a last chord, a pause that tells the listener, it's over now. But the song Rick once buried and Morty once carried refused to follow such rules. It was never written with a closing line. No firm resolution, no triumphant finale. It was a circle, not a line, looping, returning, breathing like the tide. When one voice fell silent, another picked it up, as if the melody itself resisted stillness. By now, the world had lived with the song so long that it seemed inseparable from life itself. People didn't even think of it as a tune anymore. It was just there. A hum between footsteps on busy sidewalks. A whisper when trees bent in the wind. A rise and fall in the quiet rhythm of sleep. Children were the purest carriers. They didn't question it, didn't analyze it, didn't even realize it was remarkable. They sang it while climbing trees, while skipping stones, while falling into naps on long car rides. Their laughter seemed stitched with it, as if the song had folded itself into childhood itself. And because children never stopped being born, the melody never ceased. Morty realized one day, while watching Summer's children, that the song had slipped completely beyond his grasp. He had once thought of himself as its keeper, entrusted with Rick's reluctant gift. But now, hearing the tune echoed by voices who didn't even know his name, he understood it was no longer his to guard. It belonged to the world, to time itself, and there was relief in that. He had carried the song for so many years, humming it like a secret, using it as a lantern through the darker corners of his life. To let it go now, to let it belong to no one and everyone, was its truest form. Even Rick, stubborn to the end, must have sensed it. Though he still rolled his eyes when the tune drifted through the house, though he still muttered about sentimental garbage. Morty had seen him pause. He had seen him hesitate with a tool in his hand, caught by the faint sound of a neighbor whistling the melody. He had seen Rick sit alone in the garage, lips moving though no sound escaped, a man pretending to be silent while the song ran through him anyway. The truth was simple endings had never suited Rick. He despised conclusions, resisted closure, avoided goodbyes. Perhaps that was why the song had been born without one. Perhaps some part of him, even in his most tender moment, had known that softness should not be bound by an end. And so, the melody lived on. Morty sometimes thought of it like starlight, ancient, traveling long after its source had dimmed. Even when his own voice would one day fall silent, even when his body would return to the earth, the song would continue. Passed in whispers, carried in dreams, humming through generations he'd never meet. He found peace in that. More peace than he'd ever expected. There was one night in particular, quiet and still, when Morty walked out to the old roof of the garage. The shingles creaked under his weight, just as they had when he was young. He sat down, sandwich in hand, and looked up at the familiar spread of stars. Without thinking, he began to hum, not loudly, not to be heard, but the way someone might breathe into prayer. And then, faintly, impossibly, the sky seemed to hum back. It wasn't an echo, it wasn't mimicry, it was continuation. The stars carried the tune forward, as if finishing his phrase, weaving it back to him in endless loops. Morty closed his eyes, a smile tugging at his lips, and let himself feel small. Not powerless, just small. A part of something that had no ending. He imagined Rick hearing it, wherever he was. He imagined Summer's children humming it in their dreams. He imagined strangers across the world carrying it without knowing why. And he realized the song didn't need him anymore. It didn't need any one person. That was what made it eternal. Somewhere in the quiet, Morty whispered to the night, "Keep going." And it did. Because the song had never been about an ending. It had always been about remembering. About reminding. About carrying a softness that could stretch across years, across voices, across stars. It would never conclude. It would only continue. And in that endlessness, there was peace. Rick had lived his life in noise. The crack of glass on countertops, the hiss of burning wires, the pop of portal guns sparking into places no one else could imagine. Even his silences were loud, full of clinking bottles, muttered curses, restless scribbles on paper that no one ever saw. But there came a night when the house was still, and Rick found himself alone in the garage, surrounded not by invention but by absence. The workbench sat cluttered, but untouched. The tools gleamed faintly under a weak lamp. For once, there was no engine humming, no experiment ticking, no distraction pulling at him. It was just him, and the hum. At first, he didn't realize he was doing it. The notes slipped from him the way a sigh escapes, uninvited, low, gravelly, imperfect. A sound no one else would ever hear. His lips shaped the melody before his mind could catch up, before he could throw armor around the moment. The song. The same lullaby he had buried, mocked, denied. The same one Morty had carried like a lantern. The same one the world had claimed as its own. Rick hummed it, not for anyone, not for science, not for pride, but for himself. The garage held its breath. He paused halfway through, scowling at his own weakness, ready to laugh it off. But his voice started again, softer now, barely audible. A sound meant only for the dust and the dim yellow light. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, letting the tune trickle through him. Every note pressed against something old, something tender, something he had hidden away under layers of cynicism and whiskey. Memories returned, unwanted but unstoppable. A younger man with a guitar he barely knew how to play, fumbling through chords. A quiet night with someone who had once mattered, watching her eyes soften at his clumsy sincerity. The shame he had felt afterward, so unbearable that he drowned it, mocked it, erased it, and yet, here it was, alive, still his though no longer just his. Rick didn't cry, he rarely let himself, but he came close. The hum snagged on his breath, trembling. He clenched his jaw, shook his head, muttered something sharp under his breath to push the ache away. Still, the song carried on. For once, there was no need for brilliance, no need for inventions or explosions or chaos. Just a man, tired and alone, humming a lullaby to no one. A lullaby that had saved the world not by solving anything, but by softening it. He thought of Morty then, of how the kid had taken what Rick had discarded and made it something luminous. Of how Morty had grown, steadier than Rick ever expected. Softer than Rick had ever allowed himself to be. Pride twisted with regret in Rick's chest. He wanted to say it aloud. "I'm proud of you. You did better than me." But the words sat like stone in his throat, so he hummed instead. The song said what he couldn't. Rick leaned forward on the bench, head in his hands, the notes vibrating in his chest. For a brief moment, he let go of the armor, the smirk, the defiance. He let himself be simply human, fragile in a way he hadn't allowed in decades. The melody circled back on itself, unfinished as always, a song without an ending. He stopped mid-phrase, the silence thick around him. His chest rose, fell, rose again, and in that quiet, he almost spoke, almost said I love you. The words hovered in the back of his throat, fragile as glass, but they never passed his lips. They didn't need to. The song had already carried them. Morty had already heard them, in his own way. Summer's children had carried them farther. The stars themselves echoed them now. Rick's quietest moment was not an admission in words, but a surrender in sound. A tired man, humming a lullaby to no one and to everyone. He exhaled, shaky, and set down the empty flask beside him. The garage seemed less lonely than it had an hour before. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. A place where silence didn't ache so much anymore. Rick smirked faintly, eyes half closed, and muttered to the quiet, "Gus, you win, Morty." Then he let the song fade, unfinished forever, and somewhere, beyond the garage walls, the night hummed it back. The song had always resisted endings. It did not like to be caged in a final note, or wrapped neatly like a solved equation. It wandered instead, like a drifting cloud, like starlight finding its way across centuries. And so it carried on, even when Rick's humming ceased, even when Morty grew older, even when silence fell in their home. It carried on because softness never really stops. The earth kept its quiet memory of the lullaby. The oceans rolled with it in their tides, long breaths in and out. The trees rustled with it at night, their leaves brushing together, like fingertips on strings. The wind moved it from rooftops to valleys, from cities to fields, from one heart to another. And the sky, oh, the sky itself seemed to hold the tune, waiting for anyone willing to listen. Morty, grown but still carrying that glimmer of boyhood wonder in his eyes, would sometimes pause in his day just to hear it, not with ears, but with the inside of himself. He'd feel it there, soft, unassuming, but certain, a reminder that not everything important was loud or clever. Some things were quiet, fragile, and endless. Summer, too, would lean out her window at night, remembering the first time she had felt the lullaby reach her. Now her children sang it in their sleep, as if the tune was stitched into their dreams before they even had words. She didn't explain where it came from. She didn't need to. The song was not a fact to be told, it was a feeling to be carried. Rick never admitted it aloud, but he still hummed in secret. Alone. Often with his back turned to anyone who might notice. His pride wouldn't allow the confession, but his heart couldn't resist the call. He would mutter to himself about unfinished equations and dumb sentimental nonsense, yet the melody lived on his breath. And somewhere, in the folds of the cosmos, the song grew larger than all of them. It threaded through stars, gliding past burning suns and cold, empty worlds. It touched places where no human ear would ever hear it, where no life existed to respond. Still it went, softer than light but more patient. The song, once born of one fragile moment in Rick's life, had become part of everything. If you looked at the stars long enough, you might feel it too, that hum in the stillness, that warmth in the cold. A memory of kindness you couldn't quite place, a tenderness unearned but offered freely. The song had no ending, and that was its gift. Rick, sitting alone in his garage, sometimes thought about that. How everything he built was designed to end. Machines broke, universes collapsed, bottles emptied. But this one thing, this little melody he once wanted to forget, had refused to die. It had stretched past him, past Morty, past Earth itself. It made him smirk, but it also made his chest ache. One night, as Morty stopped by the garage on his way to bed, he found Rick staring at the ceiling silent. Morty didn't ask anything, he just stood there, and after a pause, began to hum the tune, soft and steady. Rick rolled his eyes, but he didn't tell him to stop. For a moment, There was no grandfather and no grandson, no weight of mistakes, no walls between them. Just the melody, circling like a lantern light in the dark. They didn't need words. The night stretched long, but not lonely, and though they didn't know it, the stars above seemed to pulse a little brighter, as though the universe itself was listening. Maybe it always had been. The song no one heard had become the song everyone carried. A lullaby without an ending, written once by accident, buried out of shame, returned by love, and given to eternity. And so it drifted on, through children's dreams, through city streets, through the hush of midnight, through every fragile heart that dared to hold it for even a moment. And somewhere, Rick was still out there, smirking, sighing, and humming softly into the night sky, a tune unfinished, a song without a last note, an exhale into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.